Welcome back, Peter.
Welcome
We
back.
jumping into episode 34. How does the new year feel? Are you ready to read a bunch more books?
I think I am. Yeah, it's looking like it's going to be a busy year, but I think make time for the habit not to die down. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets tough at times, but I think it's a worthwhile habit to try and hold on to.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were just talking about as well the book that we're reading or that we read, Lessons of History, and that it was not the easiest of books. Um, I didn't tell you exactly why, though. It wasn't the easiest of books for me. The main reason is because I am just not good with history. Plain and simple. I do not know lots of history and I don't have things to tie down to. Like,
Mm.
when you have, when this or that happened,
Yeah. Yeah.
my, the things that I can latch onto are very sparse. So I think that's the correct phrase. But yeah, so should we dig into it starting with the usual summary?
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Okay, so a short summary. The Lessons of History by the historians Ariel Durant and Will Durant. These lessons of history range from morals and character to religion and economics. They were put together by reflecting on their larger work, a series of books called The Story of Civilization. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other comments from your side before we kick into things.
No, nothing from my side.
Cool. Yeah, I think one caveat from my side is that as we usually do, I'm gonna hop through. So we'll go through chapter by chapter, and then I'll hop through a bunch of little snippets, and often I'll call out page numbers and things like that. But just for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip through that. I'll call out one or two page numbers, but I won't call out every single page number. Cool. Should we start with the preface? So in the preface, they say here, after finishing the story of civilization to 1789, so they wrote, as far as I understand, they wrote more books in the story of civilization. I can't remember exactly how many, but it was 10 plus history books that they wrote from ranging throughout all the different ages. And they got up to 1789, which is where they paused to have these reflections, because apparently it's often considered a boundary point between modernity or modern times and early modern times. That I wish meant more to me than it does, but yeah. So they say we reread the 10 volumes with the view of issuing this revised edition. In that process, we made note of events and comments that might illuminate present affairs, future possibilities of man, and the conduct of states. Yeah, that's pretty much their preface. So I think we can dig into the first chapter. Yeah, so the first one starts off with hesitations, and it's their reflections on the hesitations of this undertaking. So I'll read through the snippets and then we can chat through it. So it starts off, as his studies come to a close, the historian faces the challenge of, what have your studies been useful for? Have you learnt more about human nature than the man on the street can learn without so much as opening a book? Have you derived from history any illumination of our present condition, any guidance for our judgments or policies, any guard against the rebuffs of surprise or the vicissitudes of change? Our knowledge of any past event is always incomplete, probably inaccurate, beclouded by ambivalent evidence and biased historians, and perhaps distorted by our own patriotic or religious patronship. The historian always oversimplifies and hastily selects a manageable minority of facts and faces out of a crowd of souls and events whose multitudinous complexity he can never quite embrace or comprehend. Obviously, historiography cannot be a science. It can only be an industry, an art, and a philosophy. An industry by ferreting out facts, an art by establishing a meaningful order in the chaos of materials, a philosophy by seeking perspective and enlightenment. And then they end off by saying, it is a precarious enterprise, and only a fool would try to compress 100 centuries into 100 pages of hazardous conclusions. With this, we proceed. Yeah, I think it's a nice introduction, especially if you aren't used to dealing with history. Because sometimes, I know when I was younger, you think, okay, history is just exactly how things are or how things were. And for various reasons, you think it's either interesting or boring. But when you actually saying, okay, now I'm going to deal with history, it's helpful to realize that basically, in summary, history is written by humans. Yeah. And so it's inaccurate, it's imperfect. And also, there's just so much of it that no one person can consume it all and make sense of it. Maybe not even an AI model.
Yeah, I think what is also interesting there is them highlighting that it can also be written from a place of bias. So, like you said, as much as there's just so much of it, everyone sort of has a bias in whatever they say. I think not most people, I think we all try to say we're neutral towards certain topics, but we have subconsciously a bias on certain topics based on our own experiences and stuff. So, and I mean, that makes it a little selective when you're telling stuff or what you omit and actually what you actually pen down.
Yeah, and it's not just the bias on one side or the other. It's on both sides. The one who wrote the history and the one who's reading the history. So, yeah, it's very difficult to get to. Well, I mean, I suppose, is there even a core truth? Like it is, you view things from different perspectives always. Like you have to view something from a perspective. You can't just view it as some, I don't know, ethereal thing.
I mean, it's like that whole thing that there are three sides to a story. Your story, their story, and the truth. So,
yeah, but I wonder if the truth, in some sense, always is one side. It's always viewed from an angle. You can never I mean, there's certain facts like this thing happened on this date, but with if you're saying like, is this good or bad or all of those kind of things, it might be true that it's good, but it also might be true that it's bad. Just depends where you are looking from. But yeah. All right, should we go on to the next chapter? History and the Earth. Cool. Okay, so jumping through some little sections again. Human history is a brief spot in space, and its first lesson is modesty. At any moment, a fragment of the smiling sun may slip off tangentially and fall upon us in a wild embrace, ending all grief and pain. To the geological eye, all the surface of the earth is a fluid form, and man moves upon it as insecurely as Peter walking on the waves to Christ. But man's ingenuity often overcomes geological handicaps. He can irrigate deserts and air condition the Sahara, but a tornado can ruin in an hour the city that took a century to build. And then going to the next part. The influence of geographic factors diminishes as technology grows. The character and contour of a terrain may offer opportunities for agriculture, mining, or trade, but only the imagination and initiative of leaders and the hardy industry of followers can transform the possibilities into fact. Man, not earth, makes civilization. Yeah, it's another, I think, helpful perspective on just how, at least in the start, he essentially says that like we should be very modest effectively, because at any point everything that we know can just be wiped out. But then it's also interesting how he talks about, at one point I didn't actually read it in the little snippets, but he talks about geography being a matrix of history, or being like the matrix of history. And he talks about how, as if you look at different geographies, say for example rivers is a common one, that as rivers flow, that's where the people are drawn to, because water is essential for life. And so as those kinds of things change, if a river changes, or lands are conquered and those kinds of things, then often it's based on the geography of the earth that people will go to different places. It's very rare that someone is going to try and conquer a city on a hill, because if there's only a tiny little spot on the hill, it's almost like pointless to try and get to that. But if you have a massive land with an abundance of water, that's worthwhile to try and take from another country or something.
Yeah, that's
Not
actually
that I would
very
advise.
interesting. Yeah, like I said, not that you thought. That's actually a very interesting take. I think one that's not actually explored often. To be, I mean, I'm also just thinking back to when you're younger, how geography and history are always paired up as subjects, and like you're saying, certain historic events are actually documented from, like, let's say, places of like arrival, like harbors, and like you're saying,
Yeah,
sources of things. So that's actually, yeah, very interesting and sort of very true, that when these things are actually being reported on, they do actually surround certain geographical landmarks. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Those landmarks, again, often water and that, are crucial to be able to do so many things in life. And it's the same thing as like resources inside of the ground, like whether it's gold or coal or any of those different things. Um, yeah, it shapes history essentially.
Yeah. Hmm.
But yeah, but then at the same time, um, even though there's this sphere that we can't really control that much, as technology advances and we build different things to dig up the ground or to change rivers or to do different things, we have more control. But then again, just his reminder, if something slips off the sun and hits our planet, then we we no longer have so much control.
Yeah.
Cool. Should we move on to biology and history?
Yeah.
Okay. So, biology and history. The laws of biology are the fundamental lessons of history. We are subject to the processes and trials of evolution, to the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. If some of us seem to escape the strife or the trials, it is because our own group protects us, but that group itself must meet the tests of survival. So the first biological lesson of history is that life is competition. Cooperation is real and increases with social development, but mostly because it is a tool and a form of competition. We cooperate in our group, our family, community, club, church, party, race, or nation in order to strengthen our group in its competition with other groups. Our states, being ourselves multiplied, are are what we are. Until our states become members of a large and effectively protective group, they will continue to act like individuals and families in the hunting stage. The second biological lesson of history is that life is selection. In competition for food or mates or power, some organisms succeed and some fail. In the struggle for existence, some individuals are better equipped than others to meet the test of survival. Nature loves difference as the necessary material for selection and evolution. Identical twins differ in 100 ways, and no two peas are alike. Inequality is not only natural and inborn, it grows with the complexity of civilization. Nature smiles at the union of freedom and equality in our utopias, for freedom and equality are sworn and everlasting enemies. Utopias of equality are biologically doomed, and at best, the best that an amble philosopher can hope for is an approximate equality of legal justice and educational opportunity. The third biological lesson of history is that life must breed. She has a passion for quantity as the prerequisite to the selection of quality. She likes large litters and relishes the struggle that picks the surviving few. She is more interested in the species than the individual. If the human brood is too numerous for the food supply, nature has 3 agents for restoring balance: famine, pestilence, and war. Yeah, those are all of the little snippets that I had. Quite hectic.
Yeah, yeah. I think just off the bat with what you read through, I'm just thinking of survival of the fittest.
Yeah,
Great moments of history are about lands being conquered and everything. And I mean, that I think plays to biology that the species, okay, I won't call them, but the humans that are deemed to be much stronger in society will prevail, Yeah, so that's
yeah.
quite interesting to also note that how that then also relate, like how biology and history go hand in hand.
Yeah, that we can reflect on history through the lens of biology. It's and the I mean, again, I'm not. Maybe I'll stop saying it so that it doesn't get annoying to hear. But I'm not very good with history, and I haven't really thought through all of these in detail. But they seem to ring true to me. It doesn't the idea of competition. So the first biological lesson, competition. The second one, I've missed it now. The second one is selection, and then the third one being multiplying basically. And even though it rings true, it's sort of uncomfortable because you, at least in my vision of an ideal world, and I often say I'm very grateful that I'm not like a president or someone who has to make big decisions, because I don't quite trust my decisions in those kind of spheres. But if I was to create a new world, I would want equality to be like a foundation, and it doesn't matter that someone with Down syndrome or someone that's one of the smartest people in the world, you can participate in the society in meaningful ways. But then when it comes to history and war, especially those kinds of things, reality is not as sympathetic and can be quite cruel, actually. Like he says, talking about history, she's more interested in the species than in the individual, which, yeah. And also, I mean, all of that mixed in with the fact that, and I'm sure you feel the same, as a Christian, like, that it doesn't, I can't quite also say that it's as simple as this. Like, I do think that there's lots of valid parts of it, but I also think that God has a hand to play in the complicated sphere of the world.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's as straightforward as just, oh, of course, survival of the fittest, done deal. But yeah, but life is
Yeah.
complicated, which is makes it.
Sure. I just want to echo to what you're saying. I think the other flip side for it is just looking at it as that, like you're saying, like as much as we're different in society and our abilities, there's also a need, or rather, areas in which people that, let's say, are not physically fit can still prevail in the world regardless. It's like the whole thing of a kid on a playground. He might not necessarily take up the bully, but in class he might do something that actually surpasses the bully's ability. So I
Yeah,
think it's also in the way in which, how could I put it, not really quantify, but look at what is prevalent in a certain space. You might not be strong physically, but you might be strong mentally and in solving problems. And I mean,
yeah,
there are times in history where finding new I mean, I'm sure the Industrial Revolution did not favor those that were strong, but those that were kind of innovative, in a way. So
yeah.
yeah.
It's not about picking up the machines; it's about making them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very valid to say, like, different at different times, different weights are placed on different abilities. It's not simply like, oh, you're strong, therefore good, or you're clever, therefore good. Yeah. Okay. Should we go on to the next chapter, race and history? Um, yeah. This I had to read through it like 2 times to understand what was going on. Because it starts off with like a basically extremely racist viewpoint, but it's not the Durant's viewpoint. It's someone else's viewpoint that they're quoting, and they're sort of drawing a picture to just the different parts of history. And essentially they end up at the idea that history is basically agnostic towards race. It's not that it doesn't care at all about race. It likes different races because of diversity and that. But it's not like one race is better than another race, which I'm very thankful that we are in the period of history where that is not, where it's basically just taken for granted that that's the case. Like, the color of your skin doesn't change who you are as a person. But yeah, I often wonder what it would be like to, and I don't want to live in that age, but I often wonder what it would be like and how I would act. Because, it's like one of those things where you would hope that I would hold the same views as I have now. But there's a reasonable chance, if I had been raised in a situation where that's just what I know, like I'm taught to hate another race. That, and it's kind of scary to think like that. In the same way as
Yeah.
like, if you are brought up in in a place where, okay, this is an extreme example that I'm not gonna do because I think it's not gonna be helpful. But there are other examples that could be used that when people are raised in a certain way, then they end up doing things that if they were raised in a different way, they would look and say, that's crazy. Why would anyone ever do that?
Yeah.
And yeah. Anyway, that all said, let's read through some snippets. Okay, so race and history. At the time that they were writing, they say there were some 2 billion, or there are some 2 billion colored people on Earth and some 900 million whites. However, many, and this is a funny way of phrasing it, however, many pale faces were delighted when, and here comes a name that I don't know if I'm going to be able to pronounce, Comte Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, in some essay or book in 1853 to 1855, announced that one race, the Aryan race, was by nature superior to all the rest. And he writes, this is Comte that writes this. History shows that all civilization derives from the white race, that none can exist without its help, and that society is great and brilliant only so far as it preserves the blood of the noble group that created it. So that was the difficult part. And then it carries on though. Carrying on with the next snippet. In 1899, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an Englishman who had made Germany his home, published The Foundations of the 19th Century, which narrowed the creative race, or creative in quotes, race, from the Aryans to the Teutons. And then he says, true history begins from the moment when the German with the mighty hand seizes the inheritance of antiquity. And then further down, Treitschik and Bernhardi admitted that Germans were the greatest of modern peoples. Adolf Hitler, on these bases, roused Germans to slaughter a people, and to undertake the conquest of Europe. And then further on, some weaknesses in the race theory are obvious. A Chinese scholar would remind us that his people created the most enduring civilization in history. A Hindu scholar, while acknowledging Aryan infiltration into the north of India some 1600 years before Christ, would recall that black Dravidic peoples of South India produced great builders and poets of their own. History is colorblind and can develop a civilization in any favorable environment under almost any skin. And then carrying on to the last thing he says, a knowledge of history may teach us that civilization is a cooperative product, and that nearly all peoples have contributed to it. Oh. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess, what are your thoughts to start off with, Peter?
My thoughts. I think one thing that comes to mind is, I think, what we said earlier about bias. And I think, just to agree with what you were saying earlier, or what you didn't end up getting into, is that if you're sort of raised in a certain context and with certain beliefs kind of being, I don't want to say fed down you, but kind of, looking at, let's say, another race as less than, then you will grow up thinking that way, and I think this chapter was a reminder that, if you have sort of one dimension of viewing things, you will see your race as more superior. But if you then actually have that community of people with different views and different backgrounds sort of remind you of what they've also accomplished, then you come to the conclusion that there's no race that's more superior than the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point of having those different viewpoints in your life to help you not fall down those kind of paths, whether it's race or some other thing. It's helpful to have the different viewpoints, because yeah, it just clears things up and helps you to see, oh, okay, like that narrow way of thinking is not the way that is actually correct. But it's also interesting to me to see, I didn't, maybe I'm misreading it, but it seems like that Aryan race part keeps getting narrowed down until we get to almost the culmination of Hitler and his acts. And it's also, I think, a warning, whether it's race or some other thing, to basically check ourselves and be like, what kind of I don't know what better word to use than ideologies are we falling into that actually we should be questioning? Because if we don't question them, then we can keep on digging down and narrowing down until something really bad happens. Yeah.
I think something that, sorry to interject, something that I've kind of been saying lately and it keeps popping into my head is that everyone's actions are justifiable. Everyone will justify their actions, whether good or bad. But it's through people questioning you or you viewing the results of your actions that you sort of realize that something is bad. But up until there's something that really jumps at you to say that that's bad, people carry on doing that thing because no one has ever said otherwise around them and kind of
Yeah.
just propels them from doing this. So it's a very interesting thing. And I mean, even in me saying it, I'm also realizing from time to time that I will say things that another person has a different viewpoint from me, and I need to also learn not to be defensive, but rather to hear that other person out and actually understand where they're coming from. And I think most people lack that. And again, like I said, like people will forever try to not forever, but people will do things because they don't know any better and they'll stand by it
Yeah.
up until someone says, okay, that affects me in one way or the other, And I think I've forgotten what book it is that we read to be like, we kind of hang on to this thing of how people think about us, but in actual sense, people don't. We sort
Yes.
of
Yeah.
dictate our lives through thinking that other people are constantly thinking of us, but in actual fact, they don't. They might think of you in the present, but once out of sight is out of mind. So I think that's also a similar thing with, in this case, the racing to be like, because probably race can also determine sort of what sort of cultural background that you have, and if those around you are of the same culture, you will never actually grow out of certain things up until you sort of have a different experience somewhere to sort of be like, have an actually different viewpoint. And just like I said earlier, like if you haven't sort of explored or met people from different backgrounds, you never have that understanding that those people also have achieved certain things. So yeah, kind of.
Yeah, and I think also what I definitely agree with that, but it's also something to keep in mind that the on the counter side of that, you want to expose yourself to a bunch of different things, But take travel, for example. Travel is great because you learn and you interact with different cultures and things like that. But at the same time, if you just travel all the time, you never create a home base and you never have a community. And so I think it's kind of balancing those two, where it's like, as an example, I live in a certain culture, and the culture and society that I live in does certain things and has certain values and so on. And it's not a bad thing, as long as those are reasonable values and things. It's not a bad thing for me to adopt those values and to embed myself in that culture, again, with the caveats that it's a decent culture and all those things. And that's not a bad thing. You don't have to be all cultures and everything, which is obviously impossible. But you want to expose yourself to, sort of as you're saying, you want to expose yourself to enough of those things that you can actually have your own culture, but yet still appreciate the cultures and the differences in people. Yeah. Always the balance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, should we go on to the next one?
Yeah.
Character and history. Okay, let me jump through some snippets again. Character and history. Society is founded not on the ideals, but on the nature of man, and the constitution of man rewrites the constitutions of states. We may define human nature as the fundamental tendencies and feelings of mankind. The most basic tendencies we shall call instincts, though we recognize that much doubt has been cast upon their inborn quality. We might describe human nature through a table of character elements given on the following page. And then he gives a table, and it has basically some headings: instinct, habits, feelings, positive, negative, and then he gives different examples of instincts that are positive and negative. So action is positive, sleep is negative. I don't think he means like negative as in bad. It's just like the opposite of it. Fight and flight, acquisition, avoidance, those kinds of things. And then he carries on to say, or they carry on to say, each instinct generates habits and is accompanied by feelings. In their totality, this is the nature of man. But how far has human nature changed in the course of history? Theoretically, there must have been some change. Natural selection has presumably operated upon psychological as well as physiological variations. Nevertheless, known history shows little alteration in the conduct of man. Means and instrumentalities change, motives and ends remain the same. To act or to rest, to acquire or to give, to fight or to retreat, to seek association or privacy, to mate or reject, to offer or resent parental care. Nor does human nature alter as between classes. By and large, the poor have the same impulses as the rich. Nothing is clearer in history than the adoption by successful rebels of the methods that they were accustomed to condemn in the forces they deposed. Then he carries on. The evolution in man during recorded time has been social rather than biological. Social evolution is an interplay of custom with orientation or origination. And then they carry on to talk about intellect. Intellect is a vital force in history, but it can also be a dissolvent and destructive power. Out of every 100 new ideas, 99 or more will probably be inferior to the traditional responses that they propose to replace. No one man, however brilliant or well-informed, can come in one lifetime to such fullness of understanding as to safely judge and dismiss the customs or institutions of his society. For these are the wisdom of generations after centuries of experiment in the laboratory of history. And then he carries on. So the conservative who resists change is as valuable as the radical who proposes it, perhaps as much more valuable, as the roots are more vital than grafts. It is good that new ideas should be heard for the sake of the few that can be used. But it is also good that new ideas should be compelled to go through the mill of objection, opposition, and continuity. I don't know what that word is. Is this the trial heat? This is the trial heat which innovations must strive, which innovations must survive before being allowed to enter the human race. Yeah. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Peter.
No, what are yours? I'm still trying to.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way of thinking about the character of people, but I think it's true when he says in recorded history, so not in history as a whole, but in recorded history, most of the change, the evolution that has happened is social, not more foundational than that. Maybe there's been some small foundational things, but it's mostly social changes that have happened in custom and tradition and so on. So I think that's one interesting thing. But the point that I think I found most interesting about this whole discussion on character and history is just that if you think about two different types of characters, you get the traditional type of person, and then you get the liberal extreme, well, not necessarily extreme, but you get the liberal person. Like I think in America they often use the term like the right and the left and those kinds of things. And the conclusion that they kind of seem to make is we need the new ideas. And often we often think the new ideas are the main thing. Like, let's get rid of the old and let's like bring in the new. These are the better ideas. But actually, if we take a step back and we say, okay, when someone that's more traditional is pushing back on me about something, maybe they are wrong, but maybe it's a lesson of history, that's a cultural tradition that stood the test of time, and it makes sense for various reasons that sometimes we can't even really explain. One thing that kind of comes to mind is something like marriage. Like nowadays it can end up being, okay, for us in the circles that we're in as Christians, marriage is still a sacred thing and it's very important and so on. But in the wider world, it seems like at times marriage is questioned quite a lot, and like, do I need to get married and so on. And there's lots of interesting and valid questions to be asked, like, can't I truly show that I love someone without marrying them? And the answer is probably yes. But then there's also a whole bunch of foundational things that marriage does, that it binds us together in ways that are difficult to break, and that's intentional. It's not an unintentional thing. And so, yeah, but there's lots of different examples. But I found that quite an interesting discussion, that the conservative who resists change is as valuable as the radical who proposes it, possibly even more important, because they are siding on the side of history, depending on the conservative and the radical. But yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, something that stood out was even the whole, like you say, and other people that propose a lot of change, and those that I think the one part said, in the midst of proposing a lot of changes, there might be many of which are actually inferior to the things that already exist. So,
Yeah.
that's
Out of every
yeah,
100
that is
ideas, 99 or more are probably inferior. Yeah.
inferior. Yeah, so that's actually quite an interesting take to be like there are those people that just want to push change, but not always try to reflect on whether that change is really worth or better than what already exists.
Yeah, and then on the other side, I mean, I think that's worthwhile to consider. And then on the other side, if we don't ever push for change, then things can be worse for different reasons. Again,
Reasons, yeah,
going
yeah,
back to the biology example, life loves
yeah.
variation.
Mm, mm, mm.
Yeah. All right, morals and history. So, going through those snippets, it says here, a little knowledge of history stresses the variability of moral codes and concludes that they are negotiable because they differ in time and place and sometimes contradict each other. A larger knowledge stresses the universality of moral codes and concludes to their necessity. Moral codes differ because they adjust themselves to historical and environmental conditions. If we divide economic history into three stages, hunting, agriculture, and industry, we may expect that the moral code of one stage will be changed in the next. And then in stage one, in the hunting stage, a man had to be ready to chase, fight, and kill. History does not tell us when men passed from hunting to agriculture, perhaps in the Neolithic age. But we may reasonably assume that with the new regime demanded new virtues and changed some old virtues into vices. Industriousness became more vital than bravery, regularity and thrift more profitable than violence, peace more virtuous than war. Children were economic assets, birth control was made immoral. On the farm, the family was the unit of production under the discipline of the father and the seasons, and paternal authority had a firm economic base. For 1500 years, this agricultural moral code of countenance, early marriage, divorcelessness, monogamy, and multiple maternity maintained itself in Christian Europe. It was a stern code which produced some of the strongest characters in history. Gradually, then rapidly, the Industrial Revolution changed the economic and moral form and moral superstructure of European and American life. Men, women, and children left home and family and authority and unity to work as individuals, individually paid in factories built to house not men but machines. The authority of the father and the mother has lost its economic base through the growing individualism of industry. The rebellious youth was no longer constrained by the surveillance of the village. He could hide his sins in the protective anonymity of the city crowd. The old agricultural moral code began to die. Then further down, history offers some consolation by reminding us that sin has flourished in every age. Montaigne tells us that in his time, the 1500s, or 1533, obscene literature found a ready market. The immorality of our stage differs in kind rather than degree from Restoration England. We have noted the discovery of dice in the excavations near the site of Nineveh. Men and women have gambled in every age. In every age, men have been dishonest, and governments have been corrupt, probably less now than generally before. But behind their red facade of war and politics, misfortune and poverty, adultery and divorce, murder and suicide, were millions of ordinary homes, devoted marriages, men and women kindly and affectionate, troubled and happy with children. Even in recorded history, we find so many instances of goodness, even nobility, that we can forgive, though not forget, the sins. So we cannot be sure of the moral laxity of our times if the moral we cannot be sure that the moral laxity of our times is a herald of decay rather than a painful or delightful transition between a moral code that has lost its agricultural basis and another that our industrial civilization has yet to forge into social order and normalcy. Yeah, so he talks about those different stages, the hunting and agriculture and industry, and how over time there are different morals and things that we find important because of the economics of the time and just the situation at the time. So when there was when there was hunting, fighting and killing was a good thing. And then agriculture, it's better to be more peaceful and consistent and that. And then for industry, different virtues are there. Yeah. What are some of your thoughts, Peter?
No, there's one thing that stood out to me, which was I actually wanted to pose to you and ask if you agree, where it says that governments are less corrupt now than they were before. Or was it the other way around?
It says here, men and women have gambled in every age. In every age, men have been dishonest and governments have been corrupt. Probably less now than generally before. I will bow down to my lack of knowledge and say that I do not have a valid opinion. So whatever I say now, do not take it as a valid opinion. But I think so.
Okay.
I think, we'll go through the chapter on democracy and that, but I think that it's not that they can't be, but there's a lot more pressure in at least in South Africa, in the general democracy of like people will push back against if there's corruption. Questionable whether they can push back more and if the government can do less corruption and all of those kind of things. I think both of those cases are probably true, but I think that there have been less corrupt governments, definitely, but there have also definitely been more corrupt governments than our current governments. So
Yeah, no, I wasn't also just like zeroing into like the current government, but I was just also like a general consensus around the board, and I don't know. I think it also could be like you say, or maybe in my opinion, like that when you're less exposed to something or don't interrogate certain things, you stay in this bubble of not knowing, and then maybe the older we get, and you kind of have more understanding of what's happening around you, you kind of think that it is of a greater magnitude than it was before. So I think that's just me. Yeah, again, like it was just a, a thought to throw out there to be like, is that really the case? But yeah, it's quite interesting to see how I'll use the word revolution over time of the changing of stages sort of mirrors how the moral state of mankind is at. It's quite interesting to be like you said, in the hunting stage, people were more violent, but yet when they kind of moved into the agriculture, so they became more sympathetic. It's kind of interesting to see how the correlation between those things. Yeah.
yeah, and it's also interesting to take a step back and say, okay, we're in this, what at least they said, industrial phase. And if there's a next phase, which there will be, then what are the moral codes and things like that we hold to now that just won't make sense to the next stage or generation or something? Maybe generation is too short of a thing, but yeah, it's, I think, difficult for us to know or to be able to, because when you're in it, then you're in it. Yeah. But also then just thinking about the universality of moral codes. Like, is there some underlying base? And I would think that there is. But are we accurately there? Probably not completely.
I was gonna add, don't you also think that's also where the bias comes in to be, like, because of you in that stage, you feel that whatever morally upholds then, is kind of like the focal point. But I mean,
Yeah.
I also don't know. I share the same sentiment as you, that I would like to think that certain moral codes remain the same through stages, but yeah, clearly there is certain influences that sort of influence people's morals at certain times. And I think it goes back to
Yeah.
what I was saying earlier, to be like, if you haven't been taught otherwise, you kind of believe whatever it is that you're doing is a good thing, So
Yeah.
I guess it's yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Yep. There's a lot of complexities to pretty much all of the different ways of viewing things. Okay. Should we go on to the next one?
Yeah.
Religion and history. All right. So they start off by saying, even the skeptical historian develops a humble respect for religion, since he sees it functioning and seemingly indispensable in every land and age. And then, does history support a belief in God? If by God we mean a supreme being, intelligent and benevolent, the answer must be a reluctant negative. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but that's what they're saying. Like other departments of biology, history remains at the bottom a natural selection of the fittest individuals and groups in the struggle wherein goodness receives no favors, misfortunes abound, and the final test is the ability to survive. And I think that's why they make the conclusion that they do. The Durants make the conclusion that they do. And then carrying on. Nature and history do not agree with our conceptions of good and bad. They define good as that which survives and bad that which goes under. Francis Bacon, while tipping his hat occasionally to the bishops, was proclaiming science as the religion of modern emancipated man. In that generation began the death of God as an external deity. But so great an effect required many causes besides the spread of science and historical knowledge. So they're saying that the claim that the death of God is here required more than just science or science as a religion. So he says, but so great an effect required many causes besides the said spread of science and historical knowledge. First, the Protestant Reformation, then a multitude of Protestant sects conflicting theologies, then the higher criticism of the Bible, displaying that marvelous library as an imperfect work of fallible men, then growing acquaintance with other religions whose myths, many pre-Christian, were distressingly similar. And then they carry on with lots of different things. Finally, the awesome triumph of scientific technology, promising man omnipotence, omnipotence and destruction, and challenging the divine command of the skies. The replacement of Christianity with secular institutions is culminating and is the culminating and critical result of the Industrial Revolution. That states should attempt to dispense with theological supports is one of the many crucial experiments that bewilder our brains and unsettle our ways today. As holy days give way to holidays. But if another great war should devastate Western civilization, the resultant destruction of cities, the dissemination of poverty, and the disgrace of science may leave the Church, as in AD 476, the sole hope and guide of those who survive the cataclysm. One lesson in history is that religion has many lives, and a habit of resurrection. How often in the past have God and religion died and been reborn? And then they give a bunch of examples. Ikhnaton used all the powers of the Pharaoh to destroy the religion of Ammon. Within a year of Ikhton's death, the religion of Ammon was restored. Atheism ran wild in India of Buddha's youth, and Buddha himself founded a religion without a god. After his death, Buddhism developed a complex theology including gods, saints, and hell. And then they basically just carry on giving different examples of that. Then carrying on, hear the appeal of the agnostic Renan in 1866. If rationalism wishes to govern the world without regard to the religious needs of the soul, the experience of the French Revolution is there to teach us the consequences of such a blunder. Does history warrant Reagan's conclusion that religion is necessary to morality, that a natural ethic is too weak to withstand the savagery that lurks under civilization and emerges in our dreams, crimes, and wars? Joseph Meister answered, I do not know what the heart of a rascal may be, but I know what is at the heart of an honest man. It is horrible. There is no significant example of history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion. Yeah, so I think a lot of thoughts there that like some we wouldn't agree with, but a lot of interesting thoughts, and I think some of them are worthwhile reflecting on, and some of them are, I think, very it's interesting to see how even the agnostic recognizes the value in religion, and I'm not sure all of the details why, and I think it would vary from person to person, but there is something strangely that humans are just drawn towards God. And it's something where it kind of just plays out in history that humans feel the need to have something greater than themselves. And in times of war, as they say, let me just reread that one part. If another great war should devastate the Western civilization, the resultant destruction of cities, dissemination of poverty, and disgrace of science may leave the Church, as in AD 476, the sole hope and guide of those who survive the cataclysm. Yeah, it's just interesting that that's what happens throughout history pretty consistently. And will it continue to happen? I think so, but time will tell.
Yeah, I think for me, what also stood out is the last statement that you read there about how I might be getting this wrong, but about how the moral system are always aided by religion. I think it was in that sort of line.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's um, yeah. I think that that kind of solidifies how. I mean, if morals are a vital part of history, then so is religion, and yeah, like you mentioned that even the agnostics have a recognition of religion, you know, and I think I know I'm digressing, but I think there's just a one thing that, if I remember back in the day, Pastor used to say about how, you know, the three B's of how, I know I always get them in the wrong order, but it's sort of like believe, behave, and belong, you know, and that's sort of one
Mm.
thing that we sort of draw out from from religion and kind of how it's sort of prevalent through our lives at any given stages in our lives. And again, mirroring this to history, there's always going to be that sense of people wanting to behave a certain way that's, you know, propelling certain set of beliefs within them and thus giving them a sense of belonging.
Mm. Yeah, and it's also kind of like that end quote mentioned. Effectively, even those that are good aren't good all the way through. Like, we're humans, we're flawed, and it's something where, yeah, I think as Christians, it makes sense to us, and I'm sure to a lot of people it rings true. But it's, yeah, a worthwhile thing to reflect on. All right, should we go on to economics and history? Okay, page 52. History, according to Karl Marx, is economics in action. Political forms, religious institutions, cultural creations are all rooted in economic realities. The outstanding personalities in these movements were effects, not causes. Agamemnon, Achilles, and Hector would never have been heard of had not the Greeks sought commercial control of Dandalis. Forgive me for my pronunciation. Unquestionably, the economic interpretation illuminates much history. Carrying on. The experience of the past leaves little doubt that that every economic system must sooner or later rely on some form of profit motive to stir individuals and groups into productivity. Since practical ability differs from person to person, the majority of such abilities in nearly all societies is gathered in a minority of men. The concentration of wealth is a natural result of this concentration of ability and regularly reoccurs in history. In Athens of 594 BC, according to Plutarch, the disparity of fortune between the rich and the poor had reached its height, so that the city seemed to be in a dangerous condition. Good sense prevailed. Moderate elements secured the election of Solon, a businessman and aristocratic lineage, to the supreme archonship. He devalued the currency, thereby easing the burden of all debtors, though he himself was a creditor. The rich protested that his measures were outright confiscation, and the radicals complained that he had not divided the land, redivided the land. But within a generation, almost all agreed that his reforms saved the Athenians from revolution. Yo, I don't know if you heard that, but there was a thunder strike there. Um, and then in the recent past, the government of the United States in 1933 to 52 and 1960 to 65 followed Ceylon's peaceful methods and accomplished a moderate and pacifying redistribution. Perhaps someone had studied history. The upper classes in America cursed, complied, and resumed the concentration of wealth. We conclude that the concentration of wealth is natural and inevitable, and is periodically alleviated by violent or peaceable partial redistribution. Yeah, so looking at history through the lens of economics shows that, according to the Durants, that wealth will accumulate and accumulate, and then at some point people will get riled up enough to either fight, or there will be some government or monarch or someone that will step in and say, okay, let's redistribute the wealth, or they will start taking the wealth for themselves, and then there will be violence and war. But hopefully, I think what they're kind of saying is people study history and come up with means and ways of redistributing the wealth without the violence, like the United States did following Ceylon's peaceful methods. Yeah, what are your thoughts on economics and history?
Yeah, no, I think it's my thoughts of that is just it's interesting to see how there is kind of the distribution is not always the same, and also I think it kind of I think if I'm remembering correctly about how certain economic periods sort of have to sort of come to an end. There might be an era in which something is prevalent then, and then, down the line, that's not where sort of it was best. And I think it's not evenly distributed as well across the board. Yeah.
But something that I found interesting, which I genuinely just don't know if this is true or not. Like, I'm not trying to be politically correct or not. I just have no idea if this is true. So they say here, since practical ability differs from person to person, which that I can agree with. Like, we all have different skill sets and different things that we're good at and not so good at. So since practical ability differs from person to person, the majority of such abilities in nearly all societies is gathered in a minority of men. And by men, I'm assuming he just means people, not specifically men. And I just don't know if that's true, because it's either that it's perfectly evenly distributed. That's obviously not the case. Like, different people are good at different things. But to say in nearly all societies is gathered in a minority of people, I just wonder if that's true. Like, and what the minority size is that he's sort of leaning towards here. Because he's, if you look at the Elon Musks and all of those kind of people who have the massive amounts of wealth, the vast amount of wealth, maybe in that case it is true, but is it because of their superior ability, or is it just because of like circumstance plus just reasonably good ability that's put into effective use, and they happen to be in the right place at the right time and that? Because I would imagine that it's like that maybe they do have different skills and things like that. And I mean, maybe there's some extreme edge cases like Elon and them, but I would imagine that the abilities are fairly evenly distributed. But I suppose then education and all of those kind of things also bend that towards, yeah. Anyway, I just don't know. I think you can tell from that, but it would be interesting to know what the reality is. Then let's carry on. Socialism and history. So socialism is obviously capitalism, communism, and socialism. And then they say, the struggle of socialism against capitalism is part of the historic rhythm in the concentration and dispersion of wealth. The capitalist, of course, has fulfilled a creative function in history. He has gathered savings of the people into productive capital by the promise of dividends or interest. He has financed the mechanization of industry and agriculture and the rationalization of distribution, and the result has been such a flow of goods from the producer to consumer as history has never seen before. In the free enterprise, the spur of competition and the zeal and zest for ownership arouse productiveness and the inventiveness of men. And then they give a bunch of different examples, of socialist experiments and how basically when there's a lot of capitalism, then wealth gathers, and then there's protests and that to sort of take that on, and then we end up in the socialist regime. And then they give some examples of that. And then they talk about how different societies like Rome also even had its socialist interlude. And China as well. They talk about China having several attempts at state socialism. And then the longest lasting regime of socialism yet known to history was set up by the Incas in what we now call Peru at some time in the 13th century. Every person was an employee of the state and seems to have accepted this condition cheerfully as a promise of security and food, in condition of the promise for security and food. This system endured until the conquest of Peru by Pizarro in 1533. And then there's a bunch of socialist revolts. So they talk about in the social revolt that accompanied the Protestant Reformation in Germany, communist slogans based on the Bible were advanced by several rebel leaders. And then that one example was defeated, and then 5,000 people were slain, and the leader was beheaded. So that one didn't work out well. And then they talk about the socialist agitation subsiding during the Restoration, but it rose again with the Industrial Revolution, when the Industrial Revolution revealed the greed and brutality of early capitalism. And then it goes on to talk about Marx and the Communist and Friedrich Engels and the Communist Manifesto. And then it concludes with, the fear of capitalism has compelled socialism to widen freedom, and the fear of socialism has compelled capitalism to increase equality. East is west, and west is east, and soon the twain shall meet. I think there's maybe not too much to chat through there, but just it's interesting they talk a lot about socialism and capitalism here, but in the reality that we currently live in, it's kind of almost a bit of a mixture of the two. There's a lot of capitalism, but there's also socialist elements to the government and how the government operates and how it gives different functions and that to people that are struggling, whether it's food or hospitalization and so on. Yeah. I don't know what your thoughts are there, Peter.
Yeah, I think. I think it's still a very hard thing to sort of achieve, to have sort of equality across the board, But I think it's just interesting to see how that's still trying to be propelled, Again, I think it's kind of similar to in the economic of issue where, that's also one thing that's sort of been pushed of like economic inequality, like how there needs to be fair distribution of things. And again, like you said now, how try to, in sort of a socialist way of living, I'll put it, is like trying to assist those that are needy, instead of just being cutthroat about certain things. So, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm just thinking, for the sake of time, what the best approach is going to be. And maybe I'm going to skip over the government and history. Basically, they talk about... let me quickly get the main part, which is... They kind of lean into Plato's reduction of political evolution as a sequence of monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and dictatorship, and how that kind of happens throughout history, not always in that order, but the different types of government. And then they say one part which is that monarchy, with all its troubles and that, there was one monarchy or series of monarchies in Rome, which was what they call the greatest achievement in the history of statesmanship, which happened, it's the Pax Romana, which maintained peace from 30 BC to 180 AD. And then there's a series of emperors from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, and they say that was the finest succession of good and great sovereigns. And they say as well that the world that if a man were called upon to fix a period during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the succession of Nerva to the death of Marcus Aurelius. So basically that was a really impressive period, because it was a monarchy, but normally monarchies are adoptive. Not adoptive. Normally monarchies are like within your family, your child is the new heir or something. Whereas in this monarchy, it was adoptive, where they basically, the monarch would adopt the new, or someone that looked like they had promise. They would adopt them and they would train them up to be an emperor. So often the term philosopher king is used in those scenarios, and Marcus Aurelius, the guy, the Roman Stoic who wrote the Meditations, is one of those guys. And then they carry on and get to democracy, and let me see if there's the last part. They say, all deductions having been made, democracy has done less harm and more good than any other form of government. It may, it carries on, but essentially, democracy seems to be a decent compromise, at least at this point.
Yeah.
Then history and war. So war is one of the constants in history and has not diminished with civilization or democracy. In the last 3,421 years of recorded history, only 268 have seen no war. Peace is an unstable equilibrium which can be preserved only by acknowledged supremacy or equal power. The cause of war are the same as the causes of competition among individuals. And then it just lists out different types of reasons why we want things because of food and pride and all of that. And then it says the state itself acknowledges no substantial restraints, either because it is strong enough to defy, or because there's no superstate to offer basic protection and no international law or moral code wielding effective force. So the individual submits to restraints that are laid upon him by laws and by morals, but the state doesn't have that. In every century, generals and rulers have smiled at philosophers, which have a timid dislike of war, except for rare exceptions like Akosha and Augustus. In the military interpretation of war, war is the final arbiter and is accepted as the natural necessity, but where all but cowards and simpletons would reject it. Even the philosopher, if he knows history, will admit that a long peace may fatally weaken the martial muscles of a nation. In the present inadequacy of international law and sentiment, a nation must be ready at any moment to defend itself, and when its essential interests are involved, it must be allowed to use any means it considers necessary for its survival. Communist governments they give an example here of America being surrounded, or North America being surrounded by communist governments, and basically should North America just stand by idly, and then they kind of answer, if you would ask future generations would answer no, like, you need to fight back for our freedom, don't let the invasion happen. And then they end off that section with, is it such a far-sighted policy, or isn't it fully accord in the lessons of history? So isn't it the right decision, according to the lessons of history, to fight back? And then the philosopher answers, yes, but the devastating results will also be in accord with history, except that they will be multiplied in proportion to the increased number and mobility of the engaged forces and the unparalleled destructiveness of weapons used. There is something greater than history. Somewhere, sometime, in the name of humanity, we must challenge 1,000 evil precedents and dare to apply the golden rule to nations, as the Buddhist king Ashoka did in 262 BC. And then they carry on, let us refuse at whatever cost to ourselves to make 100 Hiroshimas in China. Magnanimity, which is generosity and forgiveness in politics, said Edmund Burke, is not seldom the truest wisdom. And then they say, imagine if the American president were to say, if we should follow the usual, to some invading force, if we should follow the usual course of history, we should make war upon you. But we are willing to try a new approach. We respect your peoples and your civilizations as the most creative in history. We shall try to understand your feelings and desire to develop your own institutions and allow you to develop your own institutions without fear of attack. We must not allow mutual fears to lead us to war. We join and ask you to join us in defiance of history. And then it says here, the general smiles. You have forgotten all the lessons of history, he says, all that the nature of man which you have described. Some conflicts are too fundamental to be resolved by negotiation. And then they conclude with, states will unite in basic cooperation only when they are commonly attacked from without. Perhaps we may make contact with an ambitious species on other planets or stars, and soon thereafter there will be interplanetary war. Then and only then will we of this earth be one. Yeah, I like the back and forth. I don't tend to always agree with the general's opinion, and that war is a necessity, and it's just the ignorant that don't realize that. But then sometimes I have to take a step back and again be thankful that I'm not in the position of being president or something, because I think if I were in that position, I would probably end up coming to the opposite conclusion. I would do everything in my power, I would hope, to not let war happen. But if there's a powerful invading force that is wanting to destroy and kill a bunch of people, what choice do you really have?
But to fight back.
Yeah. And like they conclude at the end, it's the general says, like, just realize that human nature is going to force you to fight. Maybe you're in the lucky generation that doesn't have to. Or maybe you can like balance it in a way that you don't have to for a while. But at some point in history, the war will be back. And it's only when the war is not here that we will be fighting with each other. When the war is interplanetary, if that happens, only then do we stand a chance at not having war with each other. But if we aren't fighting something bigger, then most likely we will end up having war, at least on some scale, with each other.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, just, again, like you're saying, I think there will always be those situations where you find yourself that war is inevitable. I think it did mention about that you cannot always negotiate through things or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So, I think there always comes a time, and then I think we've learned through history that I think for people to sort of assert dominance, there's always, always gets to the point where the stronger force will always want to wage war. And I mean, when faced with that, as much as, like you said, innately you'd want to either not decide or decide against war. You sort of, as a leader, say, I need to defend my people, thus we need to go to war. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's sad, and I'm very grateful that we haven't been involved in a war.
Yeah.
And I sincerely hope that we don't, and our kids and so forth. But it seems in the larger portion of history like it's a fairly common thing. Growth and decay is the next chapter. So I'll read through some of those snippets. We have defined civilization as social order promoting cultural creation. It is an intricate and precarious web of human relationships, laboriously built and readily destroyed. Are there any regularities in this process of growth and decay which may enable us to predict from course of past civilizations the future of our own? History repeats itself, but only in outline, and in large. We may reasonably expect that the future, as in the past, has some new states that will arise and old states subside. The new civilizations will begin with pasture and agriculture and expand to commerce and industry and luxuriate with finance. But in developed and complex civilizations, individuals are more differentiated, and many situations contain novel circumstances requiring modifications in instinctive response. Customs recede, reasoning spreads, and the results are less predictable. There is no certainty in the future that the future will repeat the past. And then carrying on. What are the causes of development and what are the causes of decay? No student takes seriously the 17th century notion that states arise out of a social contract among individuals or between people and a ruler. Probably, most states took their form through conquest of one group by another. And then, they carry on talking about how that happens. And then they say, if these are the sources of growth, what are the sources of... Oh, sorry, let me actually carry on there. A dangerous tension between rulers and ruled might raise the intellectual and emotional activity of above the daily drift of primitive tribes. Further stimulating growth could come from any challenging change in surroundings, such as external invasion or continuing shortage of rain, challenges that might be met with military improvements or construction of irrigation channels. So if these, what they were talking about, where it's like hardships cause growth and that, if those are the sources of growth, what are the sources of decay? When a group or civilization declines, it is through no mystic limitation of corporate life, but rather through the failure of its political or intellectual leaders to meet the challenges of change. And the challenges of change may come from a dozen sources and may by repetition or combination rise to destructive intensity. Rain or oasis may fail and leave the earth parched to sterility. A change in instruments of routes of trade, as by conquest or the ocean or the air, may leave old centers of civilization becalmed and decadent. No, that can't be right. But basically, may break them. And then they give a whole bunch of different other ways that things can be destroyed. Caught between one moral code and the next. And then this is actually an interesting one. Caught in the relaxing interval between one moral code and the next, an unmoored generation surrenders itself to luxury, corruption, and restless disorder of family and morals. Few souls feel any longer that it is beautiful or honorable to die for one's country. At the end of the process, a decisive defeat in war may bring the final blow of destruction and decay. Is this a depressing picture? Not quite. Life has no inherent claim to eternity, whether in individuals or in states. Death is natural. It comes in due time, and it's forgivable and useful, and the mature mind will take no offense from its coming. But do civilizations die? Again, not quite. Greek civilization is not really dead. It survives in the memory of the race, and in such abundance that no life, however full or long, could absorb it. Homer has more readers now than in his own day and land. This selective survival of creative minds is the most real benefit of the beneficence of immortalities. So, basically that growth and decay happen in various ways, but most of the time, growth happens from challenges, and decay happens from all kinds of strange places, which I don't know about you, but I find it interesting because often we try to try to resist challenges, where it turns out that that's often where the most growth comes from.
I think it's a known thing to be like, I think when you comfortable or seek the path of least resistance, you're actually not growing. And only when you're kind of faced with challenges do you sort of grow. I think we've had that conversation before in the past, and so it's I think it's something that we've come across, and I think this confirms that growth comes in those challenging places.
Yeah. Okay, so carrying on, is progress real? And just a note, Peter had to step off at the last little bit, so I'm just going to read through and then conclude and then wrap up. The final chapter is progress real? Against the panorama of nations, morals, and religions rising and falling, the idea of progress finds itself in a dubious shape. One of the discouraging discoveries of our disillusioning century is that science is neutral. It will kill for us as readily as it will heal, and it will destroy for us more readily than it can build. Sometimes we feel that the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which stressed mythology and art rather than science and power, may have been ever wiser than we. Our comforts and convenience have weakened our physical stamina and moral fiber. Have we really outgrown intolerance or merely transferred it from religious to national, ideological, or racial hostilities? Have we given ourselves more freedom than our intelligence can digest, or are we nearing such a moral and social disorder that frightened parents will run back to Mother Church and beg her to discipline their children at whatever cost to intellectual liberty? Has the progress of philosophy since Descartes been a mistake through its failure to recognize the role of myth in the consolation and control of man? As it says in Ecclesiastes, he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow, and in much wisdom is much grief. How does our contemporary architecture, bold, original, and impressive as it is, compare with the temples of ancient Egypt or Greece? History is so indifferently rich that a case for almost any consolation can be made by a selection of instances. By choosing our evidence with a brighter bias, we may evolve a more confident reflection, but perhaps we should first define what progress means to us. If progress means increased happiness, the case is lost almost at first sight. It seems silly to define progress in terms that would make the average child higher and more advanced a product of life than an adult or a sage. Certainly, the child is the happiest of the three. Is a more objective definition possible? We shall here define progress as the increasing control of environment by life. If the present stage is an advance in control of the environment, progress is real. And then they carry on. In the debate between the ancients and the moderns, it is not at all clear that the ancients carry off the prize. Shall we count it trivial, the achievement that famine has been eliminated from modern states, and that one country can now grow enough food to overfeed itself and yet send hundreds of millions of bushels of wheat to nations in need? There were great dramatists in Athens, sure, but were there any greater than Shakespeare? We have said that a great civilization does not entirely die. Some precious achievements have survived all the vicissitudes of rising and falling states, making of fire and light, of the wheel and other basic tools, language, writing, art and song, agriculture, family, parental care, social organization, morality and charity. These are elements of civilizations. If education is the transmission of civilization, we are unquestionably progressing. Civilization is not inherited. It has to be learned and earned by each generation anew. If the transmission should be interrupted for 1 century, civilization would die, and we would be savages again. So our finest contemporary achievement is our unprecedented expenditure of wealth and toil in the preservation of higher education for all. Consider education not as a painful accumulation of facts and dates and reigns, nor merely necessary preparation of the individual to earn his keep in the world, but as the transmission of our mental, moral, technical, and aesthetic heritage as fully as possible to as many as possible. The heritage that we can now more fully transmit is richer than ever before. It is richer than that of Pericles, for it includes all of Greek's flowering that followed him. Richer than Leonardo's, for it includes him and the Italian Renaissance. Richer than Voltaire's, for it embraces all the French Enlightenment and its ecumenical dissemination. If progress is real despite our whining, it is not because we are born any healthier, better, or wiser than infants. We are in the past. Any wiser than infants were in the past, but rather because we are born to a richer heritage. History is, above all else, the creation and recording of that heritage. Progress is its increasing abundance, preservation and transmission and use. If a man is fortunate, he will, before he dies, gather up as much as he can of his civilized heritage and transmit it to his children, and to his final breath he will be grateful for this inexhaustible legacy. And that is how it ends. So yeah, is progress real? And it seems like their conclusion is it depends what lens you take. In some ways, the progress that we've made isn't really progress, and maybe ancient civilizations were better. But if you look at progress through a different lens, let me just grab that snippet of the transmission of essentially civilization and heritage, then we have definitely made progress, because we just are standing on, in some sense, the shoulders of more giants, and we've learned more of the lessons of history than people of the past have had the privilege of learning. And I really like Durant's conclusion at the end there, where, especially for people like us of modern times, we sometimes will look at education as, okay, it's just something we have to get through to get to a point where we can finally do what we need to do. But actually, we should view education differently. As they say, not as the painful accumulation of facts and dates and reigns, nor merely the necessary preparation for the individual to earn his keep in the world, but as the transmission of our mental, moral, technical, and aesthetic heritage as fully as possible to as many as possible. And I think if we can think in that way, then we can take on learning differently, and we can grow more as humans because of all the lessons of history, and hopefully we can value them enough to, again, as they say, if a man is fortunate, he will, before he dies, gather up as much as he can of his civilized heritage and transmit it to his children. And so whether it's children or friends or whatever it might be, but to take that history on and to learn it and then to share it and those lessons of history. I think, yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And I mean, I've mentioned a few times that I'm not very good with history, but it's something where after reading this book, I don't know if I will action it, but I would like to learn more about history and both of South Africa and of the broader world, and have more of a respect of that heritage. And I'm very grateful to people like Will and Ariel Durant, who have written things like the story of civilization and captured some of that history and tried to make it understandable. Because it just helps us grow as humans. And as Peter and I were talking earlier, take more of those different viewpoints and take them into consideration and see what they have to teach us. But yeah, that is the lessons of history, and I would highly recommend you pick it up and read it. I am very grateful that Peter and I end up doing this. Whether I think Peter realizes it, but whether he realizes it or not, I'm very grateful because it forces me to end up finishing reading these kind of books, which I definitely wouldn't have read because the first few pages, you look at them and they filled with different cultures and names of things and historical wars and events that happened, and a lot of it is meaningless to me. Not that it should be meaningless, but just because of my lack of knowledge. And so it's a very difficult thing to read. But and sometimes it's worthwhile in those scenarios to take a step back and be like, okay, I actually need to get a bit better base before I can approach this book. But sometimes in a case like this, it's actually nicer to just push through. But it's difficult to push through. So yeah, it's nice to have this kind of a thing where we're forced to discuss the book and figure it out and pay attention to it and engage with it properly. And I would recommend that you try and do the same, especially for books like this and some of the other books we've read. Cool. Thanks. Cheers, guys.